I like a church that is casual, where I know I can go and relax and have my coffee throughout worship. I don't always enjoy my church's worship, but that's okay. I know it'll be different next week. I'm tired of the barrenness of worship. I'm looking for something with more beauty. Worship is ultimately a matter of taste, and there's no accounting for that. If there's one thing you can say about our worship, it's not boring. So these are some misconceptions that authors D.G. Hart and John R. Muether open in their book that they plan on addressing throughout their book with Reverence and Awe, returning to the basics of Reformed worship. I read this book and it was a blessing, and I decided to write notes for every single chapter. So my name is Tim, and for the next 12 or 13 videos, each video aiming to be around 8 to 10 minutes long, I will be outlining each chapter of the book, so that if you don't want to read the book, I recommend the book, but if you don't want to read it, my videos will be just really summarizing what the authors are saying. You'll hear very little of my own opinions, my own words. What you will be hearing are direct quotations from the book. So today we'll begin with Introduction, Sound, Doctrine, and Worship. So the comments I opened up in the beginning, the misconceptions, those remind us that there's significant confusion about the nature, purpose, and practice of worship today. What is worship? How do we do worship? What's the end of worship? Is it man-centeredness or is it theocentric? Is it God-centered? It underscores also the urgency of recovering a biblical view of worship. And they go on and talk about how our calling to glorify God may too often be colored by assumptions. For example, many believe that the sincerity and informality of the worship experience is the chief barometer of good worship. Because we think we are more sincere when we are spontaneous and liberated from restraint, we are tempted to conclude that informal, casual worship frees emotions is superior, whereas formality and restraint really represses emotions, right? The problem with this thinking arises when we consider how easily our feelings can fool us. Jeremiah 17. We can all too easily fake sincerity, fake zeal. By themselves, therefore, emotions serve no standard. Another common assumption has to do with evangelism. And though we ought to yearn to see new converts, evangelism is good and right. The argument goes, let's remove barriers that keep unchurched Harry and Mary away, and let's make worship more user-friendly. But should the standard of the public gathering of God's people in God's presence be those of unbelievers? Where does the Bible encourage us to design worship for outsiders? As we approach this topic, we believe that good theology must produce good worship and corporate acts of praise. On the other hand, defective theology yields inferior or inappropriate forms of worship. Worship is pleasing to God when it acknowledges His absolute claims upon creation. In other words, worship must be explicitly theocentric. If not, it tends to be directed towards pleasing man, whether believer or unbeliever, which in turn loses the reformed conviction that God, His way and His word must shape our service of worship. A yet further implication guiding our ecclesiology is the doctrine of total depravity. The mind, the will, and the affections are all corrupted by sin. This means that we are incapable, by our own intelligence, strength, or sincerity, of devising God-honoring worship. For this reason, true worship must conform to the Bible, to what God has revealed as being acceptable to Him. They talk about worship and language, how language both shapes and reflects our behavior. Consider, for example, the term worship experience. This stands in opposition to the older expression worship service. What's the difference? The word experience redirects the goal of worship from God-centeredness to man's pleasure. We become the audience and the consumer. How about that the sermon is frequently called a message? The latter sounds softer, less threatening, and more accessible. This seems far removed, however, from the voice of God delivered by His servant, a steward of divine mysteries, who must handle the word of truth with utmost care. Our worship ought to reflect the reverence, yes, the despair of the psalmist, expressed over God's holiness, required to enter God's presence. Quote, "Who may ascend into the hill of the Lord? And who may stand in His holy place? He who has clean hands and a pure heart, who has not lifted up his soul to falsehood, and has not sworn deceitfully." Psalm 24, 3-4. The Bible's demand that worshipers be holy and pure means that our confidence in worship comes only from Christ, meaning when we come to God in worship, we do not come trusting in our sincerity, trusting in our spontaneity. I'm sincere, therefore I'm acceptable. No, I'm in Christ, therefore I'm acceptable to God. Therefore, we can offer acceptable worship to God. Contrary to much popular thinking, God has not lowered His standards for Israel's worship to those now in place for the church. Throughout redemptive history, God despises false worship. The fire that once consumed Nadab and Abihu in Leviticus 10, 1-7 still consumes false worshipers today. Hebrews 12, 22-29. So that concludes